we're not spending our money. This is our kids and our grandkids' money we're spending, right? And so if we're spending generational money, we ought to be spending it in a way that is going to last for generations. We ought to have aspirational goals.
Welcome to another episode of the Community Broadband Bits podcast. I'm Christopher Mitchell at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance in St. Paul, Minnesota, here mourning the end of the summer, but also looking forward to some cooler weather. I am speaking today with Joseph Fresnel, who I will call Joe for the duration of the show, the president of Blue Mountain Networks. Welcome to the show, Joe.
I am so glad to be here, Chris. It's fun. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, you and I, we go way back. And in fact, I was kind of surprised that when I looked back at the history of the Broadband Bits podcast, we hadn't had you on. I thought you were on in like 2014 or 2015 or something like that, but I've never had you on as a guest.
No, I was feeling left out, but I feel better now.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad to hear that. So, Joe, you had been at Ashland, which was not the beginning of your career, but is where you and I met when you were at the Ashland Fiber Network, which is a municipal, mostly cable network in Ashland, Oregon.
Right. Yeah, I had been in the Southeast working for a regional triple play broadband carrier and got recruited to come out to Ashland to save the Ashland Fiber Network. It was in pretty dire straits at the time, and they were losing a lot of money and they didn't know what to do. And I had a history of turnaround management. So I thought, well, what a cool job, to come in and save something that had so much potential. And so we did, and it wasn't me, it was the team there. I just provided a few hints and tips about what direction we should go, and everybody embraced that, and we turned it around. And that thing, I think, is still profitable. And, it went from being the poster child of why not to do municipal broadband to, oh my gosh, this is really working and it's transformative and it's doing really amazing things in Southern Oregon. And so I'm pretty proud of the time I spent there.
Yes. Yeah, no. And I think it is, in fact, we recently wrote an article. I know that they are wrestling internally with how they should upgrade it, but there was no doubt in the coverage of it that it has been a success, although it was in dire straits when you arrived. Now, after that, then you moved on to focus on more rural parts of the state, I feel like.
I did. It was funny. I got a phone call from a recruiter, when I was down in Ashland, and, it's that old turnaround management thing. And Eastern Oregon Telecom in the northeast part of the state, which actually was started by 2 electric cooperatives and 4 independent telephone companies as a grand experiment in competitive, unsubsidized rural broadband. And it was in dire straits and they didn't know what to do. And so they enticed me to come up north from where I was in Southern Oregon to see if we could turn things around. And it's another one of those grand success stories, I think, with the backing of the electric cooperatives and the ILECs who believed in really remote rural broadband. And I think that was bold because that was over 20 years ago, and everyone was saying there is no model for rural broadband unless it's heavily subsidized. Mm-hmm. And Eastern Oregon Telecom never took a single dime of government subsidies to make the business plan work. So today that's grown into Blue Mountain Networks. And Blue Mountain Networks now serves more than 30 communities. We're all rural communities, all the way from west of Portland. So if you're familiar with the terrain out here, east along the Columbia River for about 4.5 hours to, I think our easternmost footprint is the 3 wheat farming communities of Weston, Adams, and Athena, and they've got fiber to the home. And then we go down south too. So we're moving down into Central Oregon, and the company serves the 2 least densely populated counties in Oregon, every community in those 2 counties with fiber to the home. It has been really rewarding, 1, to prove the unsubsidized rural model, and 2, to see how really, really good broadband at urban or better than urban rates, I think in a lot of cases, can be transformative for rural communities and provide a path towards sustainability. I brag about the Wheeler County project because it's such a cool story. Wheeler County is 503 square miles bigger than the state of Rhode Island. And it's got like 1,400 and some odd people in it. And most of them have fiber to the home. That's mind blowing. Of course, we were doing all of that right as the pandemic hit. So imagine the lift for those communities, Weston, Athena, Adams, Fossil, Mitchell, Spray, right in the middle of that, they went from either nothing or first generation DSL from the incumbent, which was less than a meg download. I mean, sub 1 megabit download to fiber to the home, where the slowest speed we offer is 300 meg synchronous. And they went from that right as the pandemic was hitting. We got comments because we got one of our board members who called every new install. And the comment, he would capture comments. And we were calling to see, are we doing a good job? Have we missed something?
Right.
Are we doing everything right? Are we helping to educate people on what they can do? Or are we missing the boat? We're trying to make sure that we're better. And some of the comments that he would capture, one gal said, if I were younger, I'd be doing backflips in the street because this has saved my small business, being able to stay connected during the pandemic. And we've gone on, we've built in numerous other communities since then. And it's been really rewarding. Glad I made the switch, I guess.
What is the secret? I mean, it's one thing to say, we're a little bit more efficient than our competitors or this, that, but like, how do you build so much fiber in so many rural areas without needing the subsidies that have historically been needed? First
of all, it's just really good business. Being willing to work really hard and really efficiently. So, I mean, if you're going to gold plate everything just because you can get subsidies to do that, you'll never be able to make this work. And so you have to be creative and you have to build partnerships, in both the case of not Weston, Athena, and Adams, which are rural remote. We just did those because the mayors, 3 women mayors of these wheat farming communities, which I think is cool. They were all women at the time. They were so passionate about bringing fiber to their communities that we just did it. That they were so compelling that we just did it. And you got to be willing to take a longer ROI than is traditionally expected. So you have to take a longer view of things. Being principally driven as a company has helped us a lot, where we say, we're doing this because it's the right thing to do, not because we're going to make a lot of money in 3 years. And I think that's given us a little bit longer view as a private sector company than what is normal.
We were checking in before. You'd said that also the mayors did something that's important, and I think people need to hear, and that's that you knew the mayors were going to make sure that you had a lot of takers, right? It wasn't like you were going to come to town and find out only 1 out of 3 people were interested.
Right.
And I feel like mayors, local leaders, they need to know that if they aggregate demand, it will really increase the odds of finding someone like you to work with.
Well, and I'm glad you brought that up. When we're looking at where do we go next, the presence or lack thereof of a local broadband champion is a binary decision-making tool for us. So if there is a local champion, okay, yes, you check that box and we can go on to do the business plan. If there's not, we generally don't even consider the community without local broadband champions, because it's one thing to have a mayor or a city councilor or the president of the PTA or somebody in the chamber. And I mean, it doesn't have to be an elected official. It can just be somebody who's passionate about broadband and helping their community become sustainable. If you've got that person there, it's an entirely different story than if it's me, which nobody knows, and I come in and say, this is why this is important to you. They're going to be a little more reticent to listen to me than they are somebody that they've lived with and worked with and seen at church and seen at the grocery store and past going to the post office box to get their mail. And so having that local broadband champion, that local voice is really important.
one of your partnership models is one that we've encouraged elsewhere, where a community will actually finance and own a long-term, physical, usually fiber optic, stretch or a physical network. And there's different places where one could do the handoff from the public ownership to the private ownership.
Right.
But that's one of the models that you've used. I think it's not the dominant one that you've used, but you have used that as a model.
Yeah, and I would say that I think another reason that we're successful is we don't have a dominant model. We're willing to figure out what's going to work best for a community or a region, and work within those constraints. And they're not really constraints. Work within that framework, I guess, is probably a more accurate way to say that. And one size doesn't fit all, especially in rural markets. And I think that larger companies have a hard time being flexible and finding that special way to serve that community or that region. And I joke about us being Gumby. We're a bunch of little flexible folks. We're walking around willing to bend and adapt. And I think that that's been really helpful for us in serving some of these really, and back east, you don't hear this word very much, but out here in the West, these are frontier communities. So they actually go beyond the rural standard. There's a federal standard for frontier, and a lot of these communities actually meet that standard, which is much less dense than a rural community. And so our ability to actually serve remote frontier communities with again, urban class broadband is in a large part due to our ability to adapt. So,
let me just weigh in on that quick, because sure. I flew into Portland to go actually out to the city of John Day and driving out there through the gorge, and I've been out in around Smith Rock and and I mean, it's beautiful, but I will say, as someone who's been all over rural America, when you get west of the Mississippi, it's a whole different kind of rural. Like Iowa is positively dense. It's like Manhattan rural compared to Eastern Oregon. It is frontier. And so just for people who haven't experienced it, it is something to experience.
One of my business partners actually lives back east, and he's a brilliant fellow, and he's so passionate about doing what we're doing. So I'm glad to have him on board. But he lives in New Jersey. He's got offices in Manhattan. And the first time he was going to fly out to meet out here, we were doing a strategic planning session in Sun River, which is in Central Oregon. And he said, well, where do I fly into it? I said, well, probably Portland. He said, well, can I get an Uber? And I said, no, it's about 3.5 hours to Sun River from the airport. And I said, but I'll come get you. And he goes, wait, what? He goes, you would come get me? I said, yeah, it's not that far. And it's just a whole different perspective. So it is.
Let me just, anyone who's more geographically inclined than I am will have noted that Iowa is in fact west of the Mississippi, but I was thinking of the Missouri or whatever, but like there's a dividing line where as you go west, it really gets much less dense. So just a quick correction.
It's pretty crazy. So it is. And I would encourage people, especially policymakers, if you haven't been out here, it could be Washington, it could be Utah, it could be, Idaho or Oregon, you ought to come visit. And listen, I'd be happy to host you. So anyone listening, if you want a tour of what rural frontier America really looks like. So when you're making policy decisions back in DC, that you understand the impact of what you're actually doing on people who live out here. And we're one of the most productive farm areas in the world. I mean, the land out here. So it's not just desolate. Yeah, I would encourage people not to just dismiss rural frontier Western United States as irrelevant. It's not. Absolutely, it's not. Some of the most amazing advances in the United States are actually happening in rural and frontier Western United States. I mean, some of the work with drones and water use and precision agriculture and precision irrigation. It's astounding. If you want a tour, just give me a call and I'd be happy to host you. That would be fun.
All right, now let's get back to the partnership. So, just briefly, let's go over the one that I've already described. How did you work with a town where they own the fiber?
So this actually is the Wheeler County story. So Wheeler County got a grant from the state for workforce development, and Wheeler County really is. I mean, it's not adjacent to an interstate. I mean, it really is kind of middle of nowhere, Oregon. And one of the things that the state legislature did, and this is probably 5 years ago, is they recognized that they had an obligation to try and help all parts of Oregon with state level jobs. And so they actually dedicated a number of state hospital medical transcription jobs for Wheeler County, but there was no connectivity there. So they said, well, if you can build the infrastructure, we'll actually put some of these medical transcription jobs from Oregon Health and Sciences University in Wheeler County, which will boost the economy. That could be really cool. So they gave this grant. So the judge in Wheeler County, who is effectively the head of the county board of commissioners, he's elected, but he's the judge. He had this brilliant idea of going out to RFP and seeing if somebody would build the infrastructure, and then a second RFP to operate the infrastructure. And so we responded and we said, because we do fiber, we do fixed wireless, and we also are a reseller of a satellite service. And so what we proposed is we could actually serve 99.9% of the addresses in Wheeler County, even the remote cabins, because in that case, we could serve them with one of the satellite solutions. And but for the communities, Fossil, Mitchell, and Spray, we would build fiber to the home. They would own it. We would operate. There was a lot of discussion about, well, we really would prefer to have competition because, we've heard competition is good. And so we had discussions about competition. And, in a remote frontier county like that, where it's 3 remote communities with a population just north of 1,400, there is no business model for a competitive environment because, and colloquially, we say that would end up having too many pigs feeding at the trough and everybody would starve and then the consumers would suffer.
I do think it is possible that if they were to build like an open system, you could have like companies that were headquartered in Atlanta and other places that might sort of fly in and provide service. And I'm in favor of trying to figure out the balance between these things. I don't think it's preferable to be able to do that, but you're not going to have multiple locally based companies. And I think that's the highest preference from my point of view is that localness.
It is. And, and I was going to say, yeah, if you do that, but then it's just a commodity. They're right. Not a part of the community. They're not. We do digital literacy training. I mean, we're involved in the local community. We generally will help with local charities. And, and if it's just a commodity, if they're just a service provider on an open network, especially in a really, really lightly populated area like that, there's no real business model for them to have local presence unless they're the only local presence. We found a way to answer that concern by actually building it into the contract with Wheeler County for the operations of the network, that they get all of the benefits of competition just without watering down on the market to the point where it was no longer financially viable. And so, they got urban class speeds at better than urban prices. They got customer service level guarantees in the contract. If we violate any of that, then they can just kick us out and get another provider. But as long as we do a good job and we're a good community partner, it works really brilliantly. Mm-hmm. And I talked about some of the responses from the folks there. And, we've got, it's just south of 90% of all of those addresses are hooked to fiber now. The community response to that has been pretty good.
So what are some other partnership models that you've used?
The adjacent county, which is the second least densely populated county in Oregon, and it actually is a bigger county and it has more communities, but it's a little bit more spread out. And it's Sherman County. Sherman County had a little bit of money. They didn't have enough money to build the infrastructure and own the infrastructure, but they had enough money from some wind farm subsidies that the county got for economic development to actually subsidize the build. So in this case, they subsidized the build. We built it, we own it, and we're the only operator on it. And they have the same guarantee. So what did they get for their contribution to help make the case to build the fiber to the home through the county? What they got was that that guarantee of speed and price and customer service for their contribution. So that one seems to work really well also. And some of the benefits of this model over the Wheeler County model is in this model, since we own it, we have to pay property taxes on it. Mm-hmm. So they get recurring revenue as a county off the property taxes. In Wheeler County, since the public owns it, there's no property taxes associated with it. So, and I mean, it's not huge, but I mean, it's real money for a small county like that.
Right, they're real trade-offs.
Both of those seem to work really well. And I'm not in favor of one over the other. Like I said, it really just depends on the circumstance. Mm-hmm. And, we've talked about 3 different models where it's just private sector investment. That was the Weston Athena Adams, the wheat farming communities where we just did that. That's working great. The publicly owned infrastructure, but operated by the private sector, and then subsidized infrastructure that is owned and operated by the private sector, but with the caveats because of the contribution that the community gets what they were hoping to get out of that without having to water down the market with competition. 3 great models, and they all seem to be working really well.
And now, in order to build the networks, you still need more resources. So we talked a little bit about private equity, or we talked about equity partners, and I had raised for you. I'm deeply concerned about firms that are taking on private equity deals that are causing people like you to lose control of their firms, and I think it can be a devil's bargain. You have been pretty savvy, I think, in how you strike deals for equity.
It depends on what your end goal is, so if it's all about money and profit, then it doesn't matter if you lose control, as long as you've got, if you've got equity in the company, after the private equity firm comes in, you don't really care as long as you're going to make money off of it. For companies like mine, and and my company's not as rare as you would think. There are a lot of companies out there that are principally driven. You just don't hear about them because the big national providers kind of overshadow what the little folks like us are doing out, especially in rural parts of the United States. But there are a lot of great cooperatives and privately owned companies that are just doing really heavy lifting in hard to serve places. And and many of them are principally driven. And I think you have to start there. That was the framework from which I started when we said, we're profitable, we're free cash flow positive, we're making a difference. I just see so much need that I can't address with the resources that I have organically, and my business partner had organically at the time. So we went in search of a private equity partner who was similarly principally driven. And we found one. And it was one of those, providential things. A buddy of mine was speaking at a conference back, I think in Minneapolis, St. Paul, actually. And he used us as an example of what can be done in rural markets without a bunch of subsidies. And then he was on an elevator afterward with the guy who is now my equity partner from back east. And this guy's like, I want to talk about what is this company, Eastern Oregon Telecom. That's how we got connected. And so he was in Manhattan. We actually met in Minneapolis, St. Paul. That was the first and only time I've been there. And I love it, by the way. What a cool Twin Cities. That people were so nice there. And, so I enjoyed my visit, met him, and we talked about the why. Why would he want to be involved? What is he hoping to accomplish? And everything he said was echoing what drove us as a company. And so we brought him on board, and he's brought in some additional folks for resources and some cash, and that's what has allowed us to grow so rapidly, really make a difference. I think I got lucky. My cautionary is there are a lot of private equity firms out there that it's just about the money, and and I get that. But if you really are going to go down that path, you have to be super careful you don't end up with the wrong partner, because I've watched other companies in the Pacific Northwest go down that path and get the wrong partner, and it's just not been pretty. It's not been good.
Right. So don't settle. I think that's
don't settle. No.
Yeah.
It would be better to hang on to your company as a lifestyle company, doing what you do and making small incremental advances. It would be better to do that than it would be to get the wrong partner.
Now, you had mentioned champions, and we're very positive about that. Now, you've been helping to cultivate champions through something that we've seen both in Washington and in Oregon, these broadband action teams. So what do people need to know about the broadband action teams and how they can be effective?
It's actually one of the coolest things I think that's popped up over the last couple of years in the broadband space is these broadband action teams. And so a lot of this, I remember pre-pandemic, I'd go out and talk to the city council and I'd be met with ambivalence about broadband. Yeah. I don't care, whatever, get out of here. And then the pandemic hit, and suddenly everybody was calling me going, Fernell, where are you? Why aren't you here already? I'm like, you do remember you guys yawned when I was there last time. So, one of the cool things that has happened because of the pandemic is there have been all these grassroots efforts to solve the problem. And so they have taken the form of broadband action teams. Some of them are for a city only. I mean, and when I say a city, it may be a town of, 5,000 people. They may have their own broadband action team. Many of them are a single county. Some of them are coalitions of multiple counties. And so in Oregon, 22 of our 36 counties are represented by broadband action teams now. So, they're local leaders, they're educators, they're medical folks, they're folks from the library district, they're interested, just individual citizens from that area. And they have pooled together and formed formal broadband action team. Two of them have received big EDA grants from the federal government to do assessments. I get so excited about the broadband action teams. It's hard to communicate how proud I am of the citizens of Oregon for doing that. And so I was in the role for more than a decade as chairman of the Oregon Broadband Advisory Council, which advised the legislature and the governor's office. And I was on the council appointed by the governor to represent rural Oregon. And so I'm not on the council now, but, because of that work, I've been able to help many of these broadband action teams get started and then kind of guide them through the process. What do you do first? And that's the first, well, what do we do? What's the first thing we ought to do? And you got to quantify the problem. And so they started doing assessments in either their town or their county or their multi-county area, doing assessments, trying to gather good information so they could objectively quantify the problem so that when we go after money, we're able to say, this is exactly the problem we're trying to solve. And then some of them have actually already taken the step to develop plans beyond that. And so they've got strategic plans, broadband plans on how to address the issue. Now, one of the things, and I don't know if this is on your list, but it's certainly on my list, that became really evident really quickly is that we have horrible mapping. And that's I know anyone who's listening is shocked.
It might have come up once or twice.
It might have come up once or twice. And so we started trying to figure out how do we get a good broadband map. And this conversation started with the broadband action teams. And we have a fairly new broadband office at the state level. And so they're just really trying to, they're scrambling basically to keep up with, the ARPA rulemaking and now the BEAD rulemaking and all of the things that they have to do. And it's a fairly small office. On their list is a map. They want to build a map and they have money to build a map, but they have so few resources. So we can't wait. All of the broadband action teams say, we can't wait. So we started doing some research and we found Russ Elliott and he's not there anymore. He's moved on to another cool job, but he was the broadband office. He was the manager of the broadband office in the state of Washington. And when he took that job, this pre-pandemic, he immediately recognized he didn't have good data. So he partnered with a company called GeoPartners to develop his own state broadband map. And it's a super cool map. And so we talked with Russ. The leadership of all of the broadband action teams actually invited him to talk to us. He talked to us about this platform. So we went to the state. We said, look, for less than $100,000, we could build a state broadband map. It's all grassroots. You have to feed it with people doing the speed test. So it's not going to pull data. You're going to have to actually push data to it. But with all the grassroots organizations, we can do that. And the state said, we're probably at least a year out, maybe two, on our broadband map. We just can't absorb that. So Link Oregon, which is our statewide higher education and research fiber network, the economic development districts and the broadband action teams partnered to raise the money, and they're doing their own map. So we're building our own statewide map. We're not waiting on government to do it. We're just doing it ourselves. And so it's the Faster Internet Oregon initiative. And so you can find it at fasterinternet.oregon.org. And that all that data populates the map. Now, here's what's really cool. These folks are going, well, look, we're just trying to solve problems. We'll gather the data. The NTIA and the USDA have already recognized that this is good objective data when Washington did it. So they've made funding decisions based on this kind of data. So we know that the data is going to be well received. We're actually doing it right now. And once it's done and the state is ready for it, we're just going to hand off the data to the state so the state can populate their map and take over ownership of this in a year when they're ready. It's a cool project. So the broadband action teams rock. They're amazing. Applause to everybody who's volunteered and been involved in them. I am so pumped about what they're doing.
You can tell that the broadband mapping has been effective because the cable companies are putting, I would guess, millions of dollars into a campaign to try to delegitimize the mapping tools. And they're frustrated, and they were like, oh, we don't like the methodology of that test. We prefer our tests, which are secret, and nobody releases the data unless we release it. And nobody should trust this test that's open and available to the public. So that is going on behind the scenes. So you're aware.
I'm aware. Yeah, painfully aware. I would say that, through all of that rhetoric and all of the lobbying, both at the state and the federal level, because one, existing providers are afraid. This has created fear because the federal government, rightly so, and I love what the FCC is doing. I'm not always a fan of the FCC.
I was just going to say, I don't always,
No, I'm not always a fan of the FCC, but, Chair Rosenbergsel has been really, really good about saying we should get good data. So she's like, I don't want to spend more money until we have good data. And, there's questions about whether their new map is going to be good or not. But maybe at least there's finally, political attention being given to that. And then two, she's saying we should set aspirational goals for the spend that we're making, because we're not spending our money, Chris. This is not yours and my money. This is our kids and our grandkids' money we're spending, right? And so if we're spending generational money, we ought to be spending it in a way that is going to last for generations. We ought to have aspirational goals. And so those aspirational goals, when you look at the technology that's deployed, just pragmatically, and I have some cable plant out there, so I'm an old cable dog. I know what cable is capable of, and cable is not, even with DOCSIS 4, cable is not going to be scalable well into the future because just of the technology. Physics limits what you can do with a coaxial cable or a copper line. I mean, you can't overcome physics. They're afraid, and I think rightly so, and that's what all the lobbying is about. And this is, again, a message for policymakers, even at the local level. We should be setting aspirational goals with this, because we're not going to spend this money again in 10 years. We're not going to spend this money again in 20 years. So if we don't do it right today, if we settle for a substandard architecture and a substandard outcome, then that's what our kids and our grandkids are going to have to live with for generations. And I don't want to go, I'm ashamed at what we did when we were in charge. I want to say, see what we did for you guys? We enabled all of this. And so that's my policy push.
And I agree with you. I think it's interesting. This is going to come up as states decide the areas that are too high cost. So states have the authority, or in fact, even the requirement that they will determine where they draw the line for things being too high cost to meet the minimum speed requirements of the BEAD program. Right. And one of the things I find interesting is that you had mentioned that you dabble in fixed wireless. You said you use fixed wireless. I don't know if you dabble or not.
We have thousands of customers.
So you use fixed wireless, but a lot of the fixed wireless providers are ones that are concerned about aspirational goals being too aspirational. professional and they'll say, you know what, like what we're doing, it meets people's needs. We should get money too. So I'm kind of curious how you respond to that.
No, I'm going to go out on a limb and say, we shouldn't spend any of this BEAD money on architecture or infrastructure that's not fiber based. I mean, we just shouldn't do it. We should push fiber as far out as we can get it. And then, this is one of the things that I've often said pre-ARPA, pre-infrastructure fund, is that if you get affordable middle mile there, I'll build the last mile with my own money. I mean, I've said that. So, the big barrier for me is affordable middle mile access. And
which I think is unique to Frontier. I mean, I do think that that's more common in Frontier areas than in other rural areas.
It is. And it may be unique to the West, but, it's still, and that this is where some of those really, really expensive builds exist. They're not in Connecticut, they're not in Pennsylvania, they're out here. So this is where the discussion is relevant. And if we can get fiber closer, then at some point I'll solve the problem, or people like me will solve the problem. Companies like mine will solve the problem. Spending money on an interim solution, and that's what we've done. We just keep spending money on interim solutions, incremental advances. And then every 5 years, we're coming back to the well going, well, let's spend the money again. And I want to spend it once.
There's still another dynamic. I mean, that so resonates with me. I agree with you totally. But the other thing is that as we're trying to spend the money, we find that communities, and actually, as you and I are recording this is going to run a few days after you and I record it. But we just recorded an episode of Connect This, our show on Thursdays typically, and we had on two guests from Louisiana, Northeast.
Have
Louisiana.
you done the monster truck commercial thing? You could do it. Well, I'm a monster. Connect This. I love
Sunday.
I love that.
So these folks from Northeast Louisiana, this is some of the least connected parts of Louisiana, which is not a well-connected state. No. They've been organizing for years in this Delta Interfaith Alliance around trying to improve connectivity in both the rural and what we would think of as a slightly more dense areas, but it's still quite small towns. Yeah. And they finally got it. The governor actually flew there on a helicopter to announce the grants to expand fiber to the home from the electric cooperative. Nice. And at the last second, even after it appeared that the time should have elapsed for challenges, the cable company, which is one of the lesser known national cable companies, Cable One, which is now doing business as Sparklight, is challenging it. And they've actually delayed the opening. The network was supposed to have its groundbreaking yesterday, as you and I are recording it. And now it's caught because that cable company is claiming, oh, no, we actually provide these speeds. No one's ever seen them. There's no record of them existing, but we've made this claim now. And the whole award is thrown into doubt. And this is something I know you've had to deal with and are frustrated with, is this idea of the incumbents having some sort of right of first refusal, and how that is just deeply unfair to people who have lived for years without getting the investment that they need.
If I could throw up right now, I would do it, but that would be rude on a podcast. So
it would be a first too.
It would be a first. I don't know where this comes from, but I actually had a senior vice president of an incumbent tell me that we didn't have a right to build fiber in a town where they were serving it with first generation DSL because it was their territory. And and then we had a bill passed here in Oregon in the 2020 legislature, Senate Bill 1603, that had language in it that I still am astounded. And it did not go through the Oregon Broadband Advisory Council. They went around the council. It should have been vetted by the council before it was submitted for a vote. But it has language that says two things. It said, and this came from the incumbents, that the Oregon Broadband Office may not award a grant or a loan under the program for proposed project to develop broadband service infrastructure to serve residential locations that at the time of application for the proposed project is received by the department have access to terrestrial wireline or wireless broadband service at a speed of at least 25.3. The second piece is that right of first refusal. But what they said was anywhere that there's 4G cellular, which if you look at Verizon's map, and it's not accurate. because I've got Verizon and they're great, but their map says, oh, you've got ubiquitous 4G pretty much everywhere in the world, and that is just not true.
Right, like if you're standing on the roof,
you look at their
you're
map,
standing on the roof in a lot of places, maybe.
right, holding it up 3 feet of, on a step ladder, maybe. So basically, they protected all of their territory by putting this language in, and this language is being challenged now. We're hoping to get it fixed in the next legislative session. But so they protected their territory and doomed, until we fix this, doomed these communities to having what they've had for the last 10 years forever, and maybe limited our ability to actually leverage the BEAD funds that are and the ARPA funds that are coming to the state. And then they had the unmitigated gall to add in there this right of first refusal. And it's not just a right of first refusal where you go, okay, we're going to go out to RFP. Are you going to do it? No. This right of first refusal says if someone responds to the RFP, spends the money on the engineering and the response, and wins the RFP, then they can exercise their right of first refusal and say, no, we want to do that. And they're saying, but this is our territory. We should have a right of first refusal. And my answer to that is, listen, if it's your territory, that means you already have infrastructure there. You should be able to respond to the RFP and win it, because the cost to build is naturally going to be less than somebody who's a new entrant to the market. And yet they put this language, and I find it almost criminal. And I know, you can't, it's not against the law.
Not when you're writing the law.
Oh my gosh. I really, really struggle with that, and I've had conversations with the associations here that represent those folks. And, I've tried to get them to say, look, you guys should be taking a leadership role on setting aspirational goals. I mean, if these really are your communities and that's the way that you view them, why aren't you the champion of a synchronous gigabit goal for our state? Why are you not leading the charge instead of protecting 25.3 as the standard? And the answer was, well, that's the federal standard. We're just echoing the federal standard.
Yeah,
and
from
so
2014.
I guess that's good enough. In their mind, that's good enough. And so we should just settle for what the FCC says is what we need for our communities to be able to be sustainable and competitive.
Yeah, I'll say that in my mind, that is a pathetic dodge from people who otherwise would not accept anything coming out of Washington, D.C. as being legitimate simply because it's coming from Washington, D.C.
It is. I think it is a failure of leadership. And this is one of the heart-wrenching things for me. Not every state has a really, really robust, diverse group of internet service providers. Some states have one or two or three, and that's it in the entire state. And Oregon has always had this really, really competitive, really diverse group of, from small mom and pops to small cooperatives and family-owned ILECs all the way up to the big guys, and we have always, up until all of this money showed up, we have always worked well together to solve problems for Oregon. And as soon as just the first whiff of this money wafted over Oregon, I started seeing this kind of behavior, and it's very disappointing. It's heart-wrenching for me to see this kind of behavior from a state that used to be visionary. I felt like, and it's not the state. I shouldn't beat up the state, but the internet service provider community has really always been very visionary and worked together well. And it's so fragmented now, and money has done it. I almost wish we weren't getting the money.
That's too bad. I do think we're in that period where we're filled with our doubts and frustrations, and I'm hoping that we'll work past these, and the way our human memories work, we'll actually forget a lot of the pain we're experiencing right now, and we'll focus on the good that comes from it.
I hope so. And so I encourage people all across, your entire listenership. I encourage you, if you're a broadband champion and you're really, really, you understand that this is a multi-generational investment, don't settle. It goes back to, picking a broadband partner, right? Picking a goal, don't settle. Don't allow the rhetoric to cause you to settle. And there's a lot of rhetoric out there and a lot of money being spent on lobbying right now. So don't listen to that. Listen to what you know to be right, and let's pursue that like these broadband action teams are.
Well, that's no better place to leave it than that. Joe, it's been wonderful. I look forward to having you on an episode of Connect This, because I think you're going to fit in really well with that format. So thank you for this, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thanks, Chris. It was great.
We have transcripts for this and other podcasts available at muninetworks.org/broadbandbits. Email us at podcast@muninetworks.org with your ideas for the show. Follow Chris on Twitter. His handle is @CommunityNets. Follow muninetworks.org stories on Twitter. The handle's @muninetworks. Subscribe to this and other podcasts from ILSR, including Building Local Power, Local Energy Rules, and the Composting for Community podcast. You can access them anywhere you get your podcasts. You can catch the latest important research from all of our initiatives if you subscribe to our monthly newsletter at ilsr.org. While you're there, please take a moment to donate. Your support in any amount keeps us going. Thank you to Arnie Hughesby for the song Warm Duck Shuffle, licensed through Creative Commons. This was the Community Broadband Bits podcast. Thanks for listening.